To be delivered by none other than my very good friend, who I've been fortunate to have some intellectual exchanges with, and also even work with on the field while she came to Nigeria, Dr. Vanda Feber-Brown. So just a brief introduction of the center. I just one or two sentences to say that the West African Transitional Justice Center is looking to fill in the void of to fill in the void of the academic need of transitional justice within the West African corridor. And so we are planning to keep engaging in terms of making research interventions, as well as trying to create a bridge between research and practice in the field of transitional justice across West Africa. So that is exactly what we are all about. You can check our website. I will share the link as the lecture progresses. I would like to start by apologizing. I'm not supposed to be the moderator. The moderator is Dr. Ilawani of Marshall University, but he's asked me to tender his apologies, especially as I know that some of his friends are also on the platform who would have loved to listen to him. There's a clash with an event in his university, which is actually a Senate meeting, which is something that is very important for the academic life of the university. He's a member of the Senate and he had to attend the meeting. That was the only thing that would have taken him away from this program. So he sent his apologies to us. So I will be standing in for him to moderate this lecture. And I can promise you that Dr. Vanda is really going to make us have a short time, if I could use that word, during the lecture. So let me briefly introduce the lecturer. Of course, you've seen some of our posters. In some circles, she needs an introduction, but for the purpose of this research, I would like to introduce to us our guest lecturer for this event, Dr. Vanda Feber-Brown, who is a senior fellow in the Center for Security, Strategy and Technology in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Currently, she is the director of the Initiative on Non-State Armed Actors, and she is also the co-director of the Africa Security Initiative and the Brookings series on opioids. You know, she has a very wide research expertise. You know, I know she's also into wildlife, but what is particularly relevant to us here is our interest in international and internal armed conflict, and also these unconventional security threats that we have in terms of insurgency, organized crime, urban violence, and illicit economics. So she's very wide traveled, you know. She's gone to Afghanistan, South Asia, Burma, Indonesia, Mexico, Morocco, Somalia, Eastern Africa, and of course, Nigeria. So I'm sure that we're going to have some data overload from our presentation today. So in order not to preempt what she's going to say or even attempt to deliver the lecture myself, I'll hand over the floor to Dr. Vanda Feber-Brown to deliver a lecture. Thank you very much, Dr. Feber-Brown.
Good afternoon to everyone in Nigeria, and good morning, good day to colleagues joining from other parts of the world. Thank you so much, Philip, for the introduction and for inviting me to address this group today. And also very hearty congratulations on the center that you created, that I believe that is very much needed and used for, and that will bring very valuable discussion, conversations, and lessons to Nigeria, West Africa, and indeed the global conversation as well. So delighted to see you, delighted to be with you today in a virtual form, as opposed to in person as we have been able to do before. you kindly presented my talk as a lecture, and perhaps what I will do is to speak for about 20 minutes or so and give really quite a broad overview of leniency and defectors programs and transitional justice in several settings in Nigeria, because after all, we are talking at the Center on West Africa, but also comparisons with similar programs in Somalia, Colombia, and I'll bring some insights from other places, such as Brazil, El Salvador, Jamaica. But then, I would really like it to be a conversation with you. I see several colleagues joining that I know that have hefty knowledge of the issues themselves and that have studied it carefully. And so I really wanted to be much more of a back and forth than my simply talking. So let me do the following then in the talk. I'll talk about the impetus and context for leniency programs, amnesty defectors programs in places like Nigeria, Somalia, and Colombia. And I'll then review the design of the programs, the challenges, pitfalls, and obstacles they frequently encounter, and then conclude with a set of common lessons, takeaways that apply to these settings, but also are manifested in other parts of the world as well. And in my comments, I will reflect years of field work on these issues, including some that I was fortunate to do with Philip jointly. Others that have taken me to look at the programs as they evolved over many years. For example, in Somalia, I've been able to watch the programs through field work since about a decade ago, and how it has evolved over time. Obviously, in the short amount of time, I can only very briefly touch on some of the highlights, but for those of you interested in many more details and a more comprehensive laying out of the design and challenges and recommendations for how to improve the programs, there are several reports on my website. I'll just highlight few, some of which were written in collaboration with the United Nations University as part of a wider set of investigations. So for Nigeria, the pertinent reports are in Nigeria, we don't want them back, and militancy and militias in Nigeria's northeast not going away. For Somalia, I would highlight three reports. One is called A Bridge Not Too Far, DDR in Somalia. Another one, the hard, hot, dusty road to accountability, reconciliation, and peace in Somalia, and also the problem with militias in Somalia. Essentially, the reason why countries around the world, including these three countries, Colombia, Nigeria, and Somalia, have been experimenting and designing programs that are either amnesties for those who participate in militancy or, for that matter, criminality, or defectors program for such groups, which is a component or a particular manifestation of the amnesty programs, is after a set of years where the governments come to realize they do not have the capacity to crush the militancy solely on the battlefield, and where both detention, prison, and judicial systems become overwhelmed in dealing with those who joined the programs, those who joined the insurgencies or the criminal group and are caught in battlefield. So that's one impetus, one reason why these programs exist, is because governments come to realize that the military response alone is inadequate. A second reason is then to try to try to improve the military battlefield by luring defectors away from the insurgencies. And this is indeed the primary reason why the defector program was established in places like Colombia. And in some cases, even in the absence of the existence of the program, some people start leaving the insurgency, attempt to leave the insurgency. Somalia is an example that at the beginning, people were leaving Al-Shabaab in about 2011, 2012, 2013 on their own. And then the government was left having to grasp what to do with them. In Iraq, the impetus has emerged as a result of, excuse me, let me kill the phone that's ringing. My apologies. So in Iraq, the impetus for the leniency and amnesty program has come out of a different reason, namely that the heavy-handed response to the insurgency, particularly sentencing anyone associated with ISIS in Iraq, both overwhelmed detentions, but also resulted in mass executions. And that alone created new resentments in how the populations were handled. And so in coping with both the scale of the insurgency and the inability to crush it and the problems that simply heavy-handed responses alone without having any kind of capacity for leniency, the programs try to deal with three sets of issues. Really a triangle that whose one leg is protection of communities from violence. The second leg is rehabilitation of the fighters. And the third leg is human rights of those associated with insurgency. Let me dwell on that last element before I come to the design of the program in Nigeria, where systematically around the world, including in these three countries and intensely in places like Nigeria and Somalia, there is very strong overlap and conflation of victims and perpetrators. But very often both governments, military units, militias, as well as local community tend to believe that anyone who lived under the insurgent control has become, to use words that my Nigerian interlocutors often use, corrupt. Some people would say they became rotten, even if the people had no option but to live under the insurgency when they were forcibly dragged off, young women, children who were forcibly dragged off into the insurgency. In Somalia, people equally reflect that those who lived under Al-Shabaab rule cannot be trusted. They have become brainwashed, they cannot be trusted. So frequently there is this really conflation and lack of distinction between active, determined, willing participants and populations who lived under their control. And so one very important element of these programs is really to enhance the protection and human rights of those who are indeed victims, or at least were victims in the first place. And I don't want to minimize here the reality that the picture is of course complex and that many original victims might enjoy living in the insurgency. They might benefit. That even applies to women. The Chibok girl situation is only one face of the violence and brutality perpetrated by Boko Haram. But there are also women who were forcibly married, perhaps even raped as part of being married to Boko Haram fighters, but nonetheless afterwards were able to live life of sufficient food provision, perhaps sometimes even status, depending on the role of the Boko Haram fighter, whether he was a commander or not. Similarly, in Somalia, we see the same issue, that there is wide range and fluid connection between victimhood and agency, and that even original victims might come to embrace the situation in which they exist and derive some benefits. So there are reasons indeed why communities fear that those who lived under the insurgents pose threats to them and pose threat to their lives. But at the same time, the fears are often applied at a far greater scale than is appropriate, and leads to new victimization of populations who lived under insurgents, as well as to generations of new resentments and inability to achieve deep peace and reconciliation. So in Nigeria, the Boko Haram insurgency that eventually split into several branches, Ansaru, very active in Northwest right now, as well as the Islamic State in West Africa province, very active in northeast of Nigeria, as well as penetrating Northwest, has since 2009 affected perhaps 15 million people, perhaps even more so than that, displaced at least 30,000. And between 2009 and 2015, government policy oscillated between neglect and very heavy-handed brutality, with military operations, clearing military operations, whether led by the Nigerian military or by militias, often hauling thousands or even tens of thousands of people into detentions. The pattern often would be that the military or militia units would come to a village, nominally clear the village. Many men would either run away or be killed or brought into detention, and women and children would also be brought in detention. And of course, there are very important reports by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch about the so-called black prisons. Still today, when the Nigerian military has moved to the so-called super camp strategy after suffering a series of really significant defeats by the Islamic State in West Africa, predominantly, and also to some extent Boko Haram, the essential deficiency of the military policy is the inability to hold territory. So whether it's the CJTF, Civilian Joint Task Force militias, or the military that liberate particular areas, there is real inability to hold territory and protect territory and communities in the territory from new attacks. And that is now associated with the super camp strategies, where populations are forced to move into the super camps because the military and militias really can't patrol and can control much behind. Now, this inability to protect populations and control territory generated this outright detention or semi-detention for tens of thousands of people. And ultimately, the Nigerian government stood up two elements of programs. One is the so-called Operation Safe Corridor, which is meant for low-risk repentant defectors, for men. The second is a rehabilitation program for women and children that centers on the Bulunkutu Rehabilitation Center in Maiduguri. Now, in both programs, in both the Operation Safe Corridor program and in this program for women, the design of the programs is very similar. The length is different, however. It's much longer for the low-risk repentant male defectors. For women and children, it's maximum of 3 months, and it consists of psychosocial therapy, some basic education, literacy classes, skills training, such as making shoes, clothes, soap, eventually, after, and there is also important religious radicalization element with government-approved imams coming into the centers to provide education in Islam that does not embrace violence. The program for women has processed over 2,000 women and children, the WATJCentre. The program for men, the Operation Safe Corridor, in the low hundreds, perhaps over 200 or 300 men have gone through the process, through the program. Now, it's significant to understand that the scale is really very small. We're talking about tens of thousands of people in detentions, perhaps 20,000. Yet, particularly for men, it rehabilitated very small number of men so far. Why is that, and what are some of the issues? Well, first is real problems with the design of the program to start with, where the emphasis is on defectors. In practice, that means that someone has to actively run away from the insurgency to qualify. So if a village is liberated, but the men had to forcibly live under Boko Haram or ISWAP control, but were not able to run away, they would be disqualified. It's obviously a major eligibility limitation and problem. But the second is that those who defect can be executed. And indeed, protection is one of the overriding problems with many of these programs. When the program was established, there was huge suspicions by local communities, and that is a reason why I titled my report, "In Nigeria, we don't want them back," with local communities really being very afraid of accepting anyone back who lived under Boko Haram control, including women and children. And particularly at the time when Boko Haram was using many young girls as suicide bombers in markets, the level of hostility and resentment was very high. And the secrecy, lack of transparency that surrounded the program was another problem. Fortunately, some of those issues have been resolved as a result of diligent work of local Nigerian NGOs and international NGOs that spent a lot of effort into socializing communities to the program, and that helped deal with issues of preventing community revenge against the returnees. Nonetheless, even though violence and killings outright have not really mostly materialized, there certainly remains very strong ostracism and suspicion of both the men and the women and children who have returned, who had lived under Boko Haram control. And so many of them do not want to return to their community. They want to live elsewhere where they are not known, even though they don't have support structures there. Many of the children who went to their villages left and live in Maiduguri, often without access to schooling or employment, because they felt too ostracized and unable to exist in communities. Some of these same problems are also present in Somalia, where the defectors program has existed really in various forms since about 2012, though more systematically since about 2014, and where it has processed about 3,000 Shabab defectors. The program in Somalia has more complicated structure, and that includes low-risk defectors, the same way that the Operation Safe Corridor program features, but it also has programs for so-called high-value defectors. Now, high-risk either defectors or high-risk captured fighters are not eligible for leniency. They are sent to courts and mostly sentenced, predominantly sentenced to death and execution. The high-value defectors are defectors that are often top commanders in Al-Shabaab, who have the capacity to defect not just as individuals, but also bring larger groups with them of perhaps 200, 300 fighters. And there have been some 20 such defections, most famously or not notoriously that of Mukhtar Rabao, at one point a deputy leader in Al-Shabaab. Both the low-risk programs and particularly the high-value programs have problems and challenges. The big problem with the high-value defectors is that there is absolutely no transparency or accountability. It's really essentially at the discretion of the political leadership, of the president of Somalia or prime minister to make such arrangements. And thus they perpetuate the essential problem of politics in Nigeria, in Somalia, but it also actually applies to Nigeria, which is profound lack of accountability for violence or corruption. The program for low-risk defectors has similar features like in Somalia. It includes psychosocial therapy, training skills, de-radicalization. Like in Nigeria, there are nominally screening criteria for who qualifies to be low-risk defector and who does not. And like in Nigeria, those protocols, although written, are enormously complex, complicated, and fraught with challenges and problems. You know, they vary in asking 20, 30, 40 questions that the screeners then have to aggregate a major challenge to ascertain whether the person who defected poses high risk or low risk. There is tremendous amount of arbitrariness. And like in Nigeria, in Somalia, there is absolutely no transparency as to the screening that is conducted in the Somali setting by Somalia's intelligence services, with significant number of people who want to defect, in fact, being flipped and recruited to join the fight on behalf of the government to serve as informants. Others who perhaps might be informants for Al-Shabaab slip through and are not caught in the screening, so they continue post threats even while they are in the screening. And many others disappear into black hole, just like in the Nigeria program. So in both countries, the lack of transparency of who enters into the screening process and how the screening is conducted is a massive deficiency, and something that donors, in particularly, in my view, need to pay attention and demand far greater accountability. Like in Nigeria, there is significant challenge with integration back into communities. Now, I'm mindful that we are at 9:30, so let me make a few comments about Colombia and then some of the overarching conclusions. In Colombia, the program has existed both before the peace deal with the FARC, the leftist insurgent group, the FARC, in 2016, and before. Before the 2016 deal, like in Somalia and Nigeria, it existed for individual fighters. And in Colombia, it managed to achieve greater scale and scope of defection of perhaps some 8,000 FARC combatants. Or FARC members. Not all of them were necessarily active combatants. And perhaps far more so than in Nigeria and Somalia, it did help to reduce the intensity of the conflict, although the conflict became essentially stalled with the FARC no longer able to expand and pushed back to smaller territory, but the government still not having the capacity to really defeat the FARC, which gave rise to the negotiations and ultimately the 2016 peace deal between the government and the FARC. After the peace deal, the program switched away from defectors and individuals and has centered on the rehabilitation of units of entire groups, so-called frentes, of FARC members who were located in demobilization camps. Nonetheless, there too, the program has suffered many challenges. Many of the members left the camps before the program ran out, officially because they were frustrated with the lack of quality of living conditions, perhaps sometimes even lack of food. They were not happy with the stipends. and the provision they were granted. Others stayed, but then the FARC wanted the economic element, the jobs creation, to center on land and programs for the entire group. And indeed, the FARC leadership was asking to receive land for collective farming. That posed many challenges for the government, who did not want such structure, who wanted to center the rehabilitations and jobs creations of individuals, and who also was legally limited to operate at the group level. So for a long time, there was a big stalling of any movement, as the FARC leadership had a different view than the government. In recent years, since President Ivan Duque became president, other challenges emerged, with the entire government being very lukewarm and critical of the peace deal, really not liking the peace deal, and starving many elements of the peace deal of funds, and objecting to many elements. So the outcome is that many of the defectors, many of the former FARC fighters, rather at this point, they are no longer defectors, have struggled to integrate. Conflict has significantly intensified in Colombia, in many parts of Colombia, as a result of other groups who persist there. And the killing of former FARC members has been quite significant. The number of attacks is in the number of attacks, and those killed is in the hundreds out of some 12,000 that came out. So, you know, it's not thousands. But nonetheless, at least 1/3 of the FARC fighters who disengaged have been killed by FARC dissidents. Others have been killed by paramilitary groups known in Colombia as so-called bandas criminales. So there's been quite significant victimization, which brings me to some of the concluding points and difficulties as we head into the conversation. So the issue of protection of those who join the defectors programs or who come out through some leniency or amnesty measures is very significant and a massive challenge. They are threatened by their former comrades, both to be lured back to join the insurgency or to be killed. But they are also threatened by other armed actors that exist in all of these settings. It's very prominent in Somalia, but it's also in Colombia, but it's also an issue in Nigeria, where the program solely focused on the insurgents, and rarely there is any kind of provision for disengagement and reintegration for militias. So there is none in Somalia. There was a prior program more than a decade ago for former paramilitary members in Colombia. It no longer operates. And in Nigeria, there are various small initial DDR-like efforts for members of the Civilian Joint Task Force and some of the other militias like Nigeria's, like the Vigilante Group of Nigeria up in north. But they are very small scale, while in targeting perhaps hundreds, while some 15,000, 20,000, 25,000, depending what number a particular leader puts forth, there are of the CJTF. And the CJTF members can pose subsequent threats and resentment. The existence of other armed groups also provides opportunities for former fighters to join them. Many members of CJTF were associated with Boko Haram previously. In Somalia, people leave Shabab perhaps, but end up in various clan militias. The scale is a massive issue. Let me just stick with the Nigeria example. So right now, the processing capacity is in the hundreds, perhaps of thousands, but some 800,000 people in Nigeria live under the control of Boko Haram, Ansaru, or ISWAP. If those groups were defeated or disappeared for one reason, what will be the scale of provision of rehabilitation for those individuals? Clearly, the existing program simply cannot cope with them for them. I mentioned the massive problems with screening and integration to communities, fears of communities and ostracism. Although there is a lot of opportunity to work for local reconciliation, dialogue among communities, and I want to highlight the work of Nigerian NGOs as quite exemplary, even if the scale is small and difficult. It's all the more challenging in places like Somalia, where some of the defectors might go back to communities that continue to be out of government control or government reach, and where safety makes it very difficult for even local NGOs to operate. And finally, a final deficiency that I would want to, well, two more deficiencies I want to conclude. There is a significant risk that's not small that such programs create moral hazard, and that they motivate young men to join armed groups to extract resources from the government. That's a particular problem in Nigeria, where all kinds of militias are mushrooming from the south and Lagos all the way up to northeast and northwest, where they eventually come to bargain with government, whether they are bandits, herders, members of militias that purport to act against crime, or religious enforcers, and eventually want to get on government payroll. And although disengaging them from conflict is critical, this just sets up a constant situation where some men are brought out of conflict, but new young men are then motivated to create their own violent group to generate resources. And we see similar problems in different ways in places like Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Brazil, but it's often not around militias, but around criminal gangs. Related to the issue, of course, is that what's being really provided is jobs training, not jobs. And that then becomes a massive issue where unemployment levels run 50%, 70%. And even though the men are trained, many of them will not be able to acquire jobs, which create pressures to join criminality or insurgency. And the final problem I want to highlight as we head into the question period is very restrictive and problematic international laws and sometimes domestic laws that center on criminalizing material support for terrorist groups, or for that matter, for criminal groups. That makes good sense because you want to separate them from the population as much as possible. But while it makes good sense in the prevention phase, it becomes an enormous obstacle in the rehabilitation or integration phase, where US domestic laws and international laws often prohibit any kind of provision of support, even to groups that are going through the disengagement or that have signed the deal. So in Colombia, despite the peace deal, the United States still cannot buy even a cup of coffee for former FARC combatants. US aid money cannot be used for FARC units that have gone through, that have signed the peace deal, that are participating. In Nigeria, the US funding has become more flexible, but nonetheless, the funding can be provided for the centers, but a child who goes through the Bulunkutu Center cannot take a teddy bear toy out of the center if it's paid with US money. The US situation is really just a snippet of a broader legal international framework against terrorism financing that was constituted after 9/11, and that now constitutes serious obstacles to properly resourcing and enabling the rehabilitation and defectors programs. With that, Philip, over to questions, comments. I spoke longer than I intended to.
Okay, I think this is a very interesting topic, and the delivery with examples from all over the world have really been very useful for us. I've requested that if we have any questions, we can just type them in the chat box, then we'll pass them over. But if I could try to attempt a summary of some of the things that has been said, I think the lecturer has been able to give us the kind of programs that are available in Nigeria, Colombia, Somalia, within post-conflict context, which focuses on basically trying to rehabilitate people and de-radicalize them, and also look for ways into bringing them back into the society, reintegrating them back into the society, which I think for us to just bring it into a popular language, it's very important that we accept people who have variously either been kidnapped or have been involved at certain levels with militia groups back into the community. Because like she said during her introduction, these leniency programs are basically because governments have realized that the battlefield is not usually solution driven. And so you have to return to the dialogue box and develop programs in trying to bring these people back into the communities. And she's been able to tell us the similarities and differences of what has happened within the West African context of Nigeria, the East African context of Somalia, and which for me, one major difference for me, if I may, is the high risk commanders who are also being factored in Somalia to try to bring them back, into the community. Even though, like you said, that needs a bit more transparency, and perhaps there needs to be a bit more leniency within the criminal justice system, as much as would be permissible, to also make some of these high-valued commanders come back, to the community for reintegration. Well, it's a bit complicated, like she said. So I would like to start from your conclusion, if I could just chip in my own question, which is in terms of funding. Like you said, the legal framework as it exists within some countries, you made example of the US, some other European countries may also want to look at the moral context of funding some of these programs. So the question is, apart from government funds, how do we try to engage the private sector, in trying to create a bit of leverage in terms of funding for some of these programs? I know we have to keep in mind that most of the programs have been initiated or endorsed by government, so they are like official engagement. But how can we, look for alternative sources of funding for some of the programs, especially for the low risk? Because, like you mentioned, the scale at which they are being carried out at the moment are so low that they may not have the kind of impact that they are supposed to have. So, in terms of funding, do you have some kind of suggestions in which where we could look?
Well, thank you, Philip. It's a great question. And I think that there is a lot of really space and need for engaging the private sector. In other countries, like in El Salvador, who had negotiations with a very vast criminal gang called Mara Salvatrucha and WATJCentre, two different criminal gangs. In 2012, the international support group of the program, led by the Organization of American States, very actively sought to engage private sector. And the effort has focused on job opportunities, which is what I think is one right role for the private sector. There might be opportunities for funding, for example, the quality of the programs that's actually being delivered. But I would posit that the most useful role for private sector is to think about how to help generate jobs. But I want to also say that what's crucial in the private job generation aspect is that it cannot center solely on those who have been men in arms or women who lived with militants. whether they are the jihadi groups or whether they are militias, because of the moral hazard problem and also real community resentments across the world, including in the El Salvador program. Many victims, communities who suffered criminal violence or violence from Boko Haram or Shabab, feared that profound injustice that those who participated or had to endure would then receive benefits and the community was not. So there needs to be really comparable effort to provide resources to local communities such as jobs. So, you know, if a private company said, okay, I will make an effort to hire 5 defectors from this area or 5 people who have gone through rehabilitation program, it would be very appropriate and important to hire an equivalent number, 5 members of the community. And it does not necessarily have to be one-to-one. Perhaps there could be other source of provision of benefits for the community. So some former women are hired, maybe the community gets improvement in water system delivery. In Maiduguri itself, there are some programs that run by NGOs that I think are very impressive in its design, that focus on widows of CJTF, widows of Boko Haram, and other widows in community, and mix them in a joint program where they together learn skills and then are given packages to start their services. And what's nice about this mixing of individuals is that it tends to also not simply create equity in the benefits being delivered, but actually helps ease some of the resentment, suspicions, and create bonds, sort of deeper reconciliation.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just take some of the questions that we have. I think the point you're making is that there should be like a holistic conception of interventions from the private sector in terms of integrating both the victims and perpetrators during their interventions, so that you don't leave some members of the community behind. There's a question from Joshua Kitayo. She's looking at the conceptual clarification of community. The question is whether the use of the word community in government discourses on counterinsurgency is having a negative impact, if you may, on the kind of interventions and that they are making in terms of trying to integrate people back into the community. The second thing that is also asking is about the involvement of donors, to say how is the intervention of donors within the counterinsurgency narrative venture in Nigeria. How are donor interventions affecting the successes of these programs, especially when it comes to the issue of eligibility to some of these interventions?
Well, let me start with Mr. Akintayo's second questions about arbitrariness and whether arbitrariness in the programs is due to the external donor element. I would strongly suggest that not, and that this is not also unique to Nigeria, in Somalia as well. I would say that the role of donors has actually been very positive in demanding, insisting, encouraging governments who run such programs to create more predictability and to provide help with the design of the screening criteria, to have screening criteria that are written, that are on paper. In my view, to the extent that arbitrariness persists, it is because in neither Nigeria or Somalia, and for the matter Niger, which has its own version or trying to stand up its own version of the defectors programs, donors are excluded, and local NGOs, anyone is excluded from the actual screening. So the big arbitrariness problem is the utter black hole, lack of transparency in the screening. Donors only see those who are designed, who are selected, who are assessed low risk, who are then given to the camps. So I would actually like to see far more transparency, joint committees, presence of donors, presence of NGO in the screening, which is absent altogether. I think that would help reduce the arbitrariness. The first question on who, what is community, I think it's a very important one. And, obviously those are some tough challenges. In an immediate sense, the community is obviously the village or the space where the person who is a victim or who is a perpetrator or who is in between lived. Now that becomes very complex when there is mass displacement, where people go in IDP camps, live in IDP camps. A set of the IDP camp becomes a community, but perhaps not the entire camps. I don't think that we can answer those questions in the abstract. And what is really needed is the work in NGOs of going to the community and talking not just with clan elders like in Somalia, or not just with bulamas like in Nigeria, but with other authorities, with other members of the community to gauge their views of what they fear and how can their issues, their fears and their needs be addressed, and how can reconciliation be facilitated. There are two challenges in contexts like Nigeria, Niger, or Somalia. Often the interlocutors become the traditional authorities. And of course, that just reinforces their authority, which sometimes may be positive for the community, other times could be abusive. The interlocutors also become the militias because they have authority by the virtue of holding weapons, which only strengthens their political power and capital. In places like Colombia, where there is an absence of traditional authority, not always, but often, there are traditional authorities in indigenous communities, for example, knowing whom to engage might be more problematic. So, there are different pros and cons of who is approached and how then engagement then empowers them and perhaps shrinks accountability or sometimes enhances it. But it requires diligent work on the ground and mapping, and to do the best we can with the circumstances that exist. I also want to say that I highlighted problems, but I don't want to imply at all that such programs should be canceled. The opposite. They should be, yes, improved, but also strengthened and expanded because they play a critical role in reducing conflict and suffering. And we want them to play as robust and efficacious as they can. But my comments are not meant to say we should not be doing that. The alternative is what's happening in Iraq, where thousands of people are executed en masse for some presumed association with the Islamic State. This is still going on. Just about a week ago, Iraq executed another thousands of people for ISIS membership. And I am very skeptical that those approaches generate either justice or peace.
Yeah. That's very elaborate. Let me take the next question from Nancy. She is looking at the kind of conflict that may emerge in terms of granting amnesties and the culture of impunity. So she's looking at the situation of what we can consider gross violations of human rights, especially as provided for in international law, in terms of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. So she's looking at how possible are these programs within certain contexts in terms of trying to create a balance between these gross violations and also being lenient in that context. Then I would also like to just take a second one from Florence. She's talking about the possible or peculiar challenges, as she puts it, in terms of designing traditional justice program, especially where it's like impossible to negotiate with terrorists. I know Nigeria is still grappling with the killings of 43 farmers. Well, the figures are always being conflicted. Some say 74 or 5, some say 100 and something, by Boko Haram. So it's still really very difficult to negotiate with some of these people. So she's saying that, can you, in this context of terrorism within Nigeria's northeast, still talk about the possibility of the post-conflict environment?
Great. Thank you so much for the question of war crimes against humanity or war crimes and accountability. It's an absolutely fundamental one. So the way the programs, the defector programs and transitional justice programs are designed, including broader transitional program in Colombia, is that they are to exclude very serious crime, war crimes, and other severe abuses. Those who perpetrate such crimes are not to be given amnesty, they might still be given leniency. So in Colombia, for example, if people confess to their crime, they will face mild punishments such as house imprisonment, perhaps not, or house detention, not even imprisonment. In a prior iteration with the paramilitary groups, the leaders that committed such crime were given up to 8 years in prison. So there is not supposed to be blanket amnesty, and it's certainly supposed to exclude very high crimes against humanity to be in compliance with international law. Nonetheless, the implementation is varied, and I already alluded to the high value defectors program in Somalia that completely shirks and avoids this issue. So commanders like Mukhtar Rabao, who committed very serious abuses, are given total blanket immunity and are then allowed to participate in political process and run to become the president of a state within Somalia. It did not happen because the government arbitrarily arrested him afterwards. But this part of his initial deal, there was blanket amnesty. I think that's very problematic. And I would, however, posit that blanket amnesty programs are not good. And there should be punishment for serious crimes, but that punishment cannot be directed solely against the insurgents. There also needs to be serious, meaningful punishment for military forces, police forces that commit massacres, extrajudicial killings, that torture, that commit war crimes and crimes against humanities. And of course, they are manifest and very present in a place like Somalia, in Nigeria, that there is no accountability whatever. In Nigeria, there might be commissions or investigations. Often the findings are shoved in a drawer and no one ever sees what was found in the commission. Sometimes perhaps military tribunals might arrest someone, but again, there is no systematic, transparent information of those soldiers who were arrested for severe crimes, what kind of processes and punishments they actually face. And sorry, the second question was what to do about if it's not possible to negotiate. Well, you know, I think that first of all, the assumption that it's not possible to negotiate is challenging one, and one that needs to be examined. The Nigerian government repeatedly negotiated with Boko Haram. It didn't lead anywhere, and Boko Haram rejected the deals, the terms of the negotiations, but there were negotiations. There is talk that of negotiations with Al-Shabaab, and in fact, the United States just led a very wildcat, unplanned, very problematic effort to have a spot negotiation with Al-Shabaab, which obviously didn't lead anywhere because it was so mishandled by the Trump administration. And the US has negotiated and struck a deal with the Taliban, a deal that many questions and dislike. Increasingly, governments are negotiated with even criminal groups, a topic more controversial than negotiations with even insurgents, even jihadi insurgents. And I am part of a project with another think tank called called IFIT, which Institute for Integrated Transition, which specializes in negotiations, and our project is about negotiating with criminal groups like the Maras, like the gangs in El Salvador I mentioned. The larger issue, however, that's taking place, and that's like a real challenge, is that many of these processes, these leniency, amnesty, defectors processes, take place in the absence of a peace deal. and they take place in the context of very active fighting. And that poses real strain and challenges and has put a fundamentally different spin on DDR than the established UN international processes about DDR, because they are not simply meant to address issues of human rights. They are meant to change the battlefield, to weaken the insurgent groups. They are an offensive tool as much as they are a tool of human rights and reconciliation and peace. And that then generates the massive problem that I spoke about of those who do participate, are accepted into the programs, facing threats to their lives and being killed by their former comrades or by other armed groups that exist.
Wow, thank you very much. So I'll take the next questions. The first is from Max. Max is a student at Cambridge. He's trying to ask about trying to demobilize state-sponsored militia, and I think he was referring to the CJTF. So what he's looking at is the sense of the kinds of criminality among some of these militias who perhaps are trying to act on behalf of the state in quotes, or are trying to be, there are structures that are being formalized by the state, but some of them, you know, still commit some of the crimes. So how does this affect the kind of demobilization in terms of the kind of arms that these people carry, and how does it impact on security in the environment? Nancy made a comment, which I think is very important in terms of trying to integrate traditional and customary approaches. I don't know whether in terms of forgiveness and reconciliation in these leniency programs. I don't know whether you also love to touch on that.
Sure, great. Thank you. Thanks for your question, Max, and great seeing you. Hope you're thriving at Cambridge. You know, I touched on the militia issues, and I'm conscious of the time, so I would highlight two reports, recent reports of mine from this spring that deal with militias in Nigeria and Somalia, and both of which go in great depths to look at DDR reconciliation rehabilitation programs for them. So one is called Militias and Militancy in Nigeria's Northeast, Not Going Away. And the other is called The Problem with Militias in Somalia, Everyone Wants Them. Or almost everyone wants them, is in fact the title of the report. In Nigeria, as I mentioned, that so first of all, I very much believe that the rehabilitation reintegration programs need to exist for the militias, and that a critical and crucial problem with the design, with the effectiveness of the existing programs is that they often only target the insurgents and do not target the militias. That's very problematic for many reasons, including because there is often fluidity between who is a militia and who is an insurgent. And that's not unique to the African cases. We see it around the world. Even in Colombia, for example, the paramilitaries, the so-called Autodefensas de Colombia, before they demobilized, recruited very many FARC members, their arch enemy, whom they brutally fought on the battlefield. They also recruited them to join them. So one problem of not having the programs for the militias is that there is fluidity of membership between them. The second problem is the one that I spoke about, namely that they are then source of attacks, and that people fear to leave the battlefield, fear to conclude peace deals or accept amnesties because they are feared that they will be killed by the opponents. And we see that still today in Colombia as well. The descendants of the paramilitary forces, so-called bandas criminales, are also killing former FARC members. It's not just the dissident FARC groups that are killing them. They are being killed or prevented, run out of places where they want to live by the militias. So there is big under provision of what needs to be delivered. So the programs need to focus them. In Nigeria, there are nascent programs of DDR for the CJTF, particularly. They are nominally open also for the vigilante group in Nigeria and hunters group in practice, the reach to these other types of militias up in the northeast and northwest is very limited. So they predominantly center on CJTF, and they predominantly center on CJTF in Maiduguri because of access issues and lack of security outside of Maiduguri. As I said, they are small, they are nascent, they face some of the same scale challenges. They can deliver programming for people in the hundreds, maybe 1,000, where the militias count among themselves 15, 20, 25, 30,000. I think that some of the higher numbers are exaggerations, but nonetheless, there is a vast scope. But the other very substantial problem is that many of the militias don't want to demobilize. And that's true not just in Nigeria, it's true in Afghanistan, because it's true elsewhere, because they get power and status and recognition, and because they become politically useful to politicians. Politicians are also not keen to see them demobilized because they use them as a mechanism to get votes, beat out votes and resources from communities. So I often say that militias are like glue. Once you squeeze them out of the tube, it's really hard to put them back in the tube. They stick, and they have some benefits in protecting community, but they also become big sources of usurping authority, perpetrating human rights abuses, challenging procedures. They often are not accountable. And as I mentioned, the other problem across Nigeria, in particularly in Somalia also, is that there are these moral hazards that young men learn, that they create the militia, they fight crime, whether it's in Lagos or up in the north. They get on government payroll, something is created for them, like police, transport police units, transport law enforcement units. They get on permanent government payroll. So that's what they want. They don't want to demobilize. They don't want to go through DDR. Instead, they want to be anointed as a new official branch of the government and have permanent payroll. And they thus create examples for everyone else to try to do this. And what we see in Nigeria is the mushrooming of militias around the country. In Colombia as well, after the demobilization of the paramilitaries in 2007 of the Autodefensas de Colombia, new units emerged. The government calls them bandas criminales, criminal bands. Many are, however, direct descendants, really neo-militias, neo-paramilitary forces. And the final problem that I want to highlight here is that links to the issues of accountability. That oftentimes when the programs are created for the militias, there is no screening or very limited, very poor screening for the crimes they committed. And they often get blank check. It's the screening for that is far less than for the jihadists, for the insurgents. There is no screening of are they low risk or are they high risk? Have they committed crimes? They simply get absorbed into official forces, or they get these special programs created for them. Colombia, the Autodefensas program, having been one exception where there was screening and where there was selecting out those who committed war crimes. And that, of course, perpetuate the problem, the core of the problem, the root of all the problem, which is lack of accountability for taking arms onto oneself and brutalizing those around you and not facing any kind of accountability for that. Sorry, I'm looking at the question about Nancy's question about traditional, the role of traditional justice. You know, I think it's very important. And in Somalia, I spoke about the official government run programs that has donor support, but there is also informal disengagement of Shabab fighters that takes place through clan processes. And we have very little transparency, very little systematic studies or assessment picture, really, of how those processes work. Of course, Rwanda is famous in using some of the traditional, and to some extent Uganda as well, in using traditional healing, juju magic procedures to enable reconciliation and rehabilitation. And I think that we can learn from them. I would emphasize, though, that the traditional justice is not always benevolent, not always inclusive, and not always accountable either. For example, in the Somalia setting, women who come from marginal clans and who are women will be very discriminated and disadvantaged in trying to go through any kind of traditional justice care process. Care is the name of the processes there. So it serves well men from dominant clans, particularly who come from privileged families related to clan elders. It really does not serve well to women from marginalized clans who will actually have far better, more equitable and predictable access to justice in Al-Shabaab courts. And that's not unique. I mean, we see similar challenges in places like Nepal or India, not among just Muslim communities, but Hindu communities, and the panchayat structures that will, the traditional panchayat structures will very discriminate and marginalize against lower castes, women from lower caste. So I think we can learn, study, draw from, enable traditional reconciliation processes, but be very conscious in understanding their limitations and their programs. And in other cases, the traditional structures might be completely decimated. I mean, I'm thinking here about Liberia and Sierra Leone and the wars there that were very much wars of young men rebelling against traditional authority and really smashing traditional authority in those processes. Or in Afghanistan, where the Taliban for 2 decades, 3 decades now, well, 2 decades since the 1990s, has systematically tried to crush the Khans, the traditional authorities. So, you know, that's another dimension, how potent are the traditional system today is another issue that needs to be looked at carefully, very specifically in a particular location.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just take the final 2 questions. I think they are very important. Sorry, we'll just share the other questions with our lecturer if we're not able to take yours. So I'll take the one from Ezra, which I think is very important. She's talking about the architecture in terms of spaces where these DDR programs take place. And I think it's very important. For instance, from my visit to the Operation Safe Corridor camp in Gombe, I found out that they still use some kind of languages that could be, they are militarized languages that psychologically may not even be suited for the program. Like they say, they keep these repentant guys, as they call them, in cages. And I was asking, when you use the word cage for people you're trying to reintegrate back into the community, you are still given a bit of a sense of criminality in the spaces where these people exist. But I think Ezra's question is particularly on the kind of architecture, the structures, the provisions that they have in some of these radicalization centers. What's your evaluation of them and the sense of how this can be improved? And there's a final question from Musa, who is asking about the exclusion of community members from some of these processes, which is an issue that has been belaboured in terms of trying not to shove the returnees back into their communities. I know from exchanges with those who stay in some of these communities that some of them, those that are lenient enough may say that these people should return, but they cannot guarantee their safety. So they are disposed to them returning, but they are not telling you that when they come back to these communities, they are going to be safe. So how do we get a sort of legitimacy for some of these returnees within the community.
Philip, you might help me along. I got Musa's questions about the role of community, and I got the question, Esra's question about the architecture. Let me start with them, and then please remind me of the other issues that you spoke about. My reception is not that great, so if you afterwards direct me to the other comments. Mr. Akchan, if I'm pronouncing your name properly, I would say that the issue of physical spaces and physical design as part of healing, reconciliation, and those rehabilitation programs has received really far more attention outside of many of the war zone contexts than in the war zones. For example, in France, with all its massive challenges of integrating people from Africa or other spaces where France had colonies, as well as in terms of anti-crime activities, there was a lot of work done on architecture, design of the banlieues as a way to avoid segregation, ostracism, and try to achieve reduction in crime. You know, the quality and outcomes of these architecturally focused spaces has been highly varied. Some have been more successful than others. There's been a little bit of similar focus in Brazil when it has to deal with criminality, design of cities. I would say the results that are even more mediocre and unsatisfactory than in France, but nonetheless there have been some conscious efforts to try to physically link the marginalized neighborhoods in Brazil, in Rio, known as favelas, via better access. And sort of the hallmark of that was in Colombia, in the city of Medellin, where the poor communities, the slums known as comunas, were integrated with the rest of the city via a giant escalator as well as a lift. The comunas there are often on the hills where the Medellin city business center of economic activity is in the valley. In the African or war context, we are often talking about centers that are very basic, that will have some beds, that will have some plastic chairs, the occasional table. Maybe they have a soccer pitch. In Somalia, some of the rehabilitation centers have been quite creative in allowing and promoting, for example, vegetable cultivation and teaching people agricultural skills, as well as providing opportunities for members in the center, as well as having the soccer fields or physical activity spaces. So I think there can be done much more on that. You know, some of the centers in places like Niger are really just quite beyond basic, really inadequate of being bare cover from heat and nothing to do, where really much more resources need to go in. So I think there are very many opportunities also in separating men and women, providing opportunities for children, playground opportunities. But the issue is one of resources being just so basic, and that this often just is not even part of the thinking, or it's part of the thinking only in like very basic terms, like having a separate space for women and men, and not even that sometimes. But I think that there is a lot of opportunity for engagement. Nonetheless, I would also say that there is a flip side to this, namely that as basic as the conditions are in the rehabilitation centers in places like Bulunkutu or in the rehabilitation center in Mogadishu or Baidoa, is they're still better than the conditions that people have on the outside. And then generates resentments of communities whose children have no playground, there is no soccer pitch, And it also generates situations when many of the people don't want to leave the camp. So I interviewed quite a few young men who as children were in Bulunkutu, for example, and they said it was the best 3 months of their life, and they really didn't want to leave. And once they left, they had no equivalent shelter, no equivalent supply of food, let alone any of the other opportunities. And they really were very, very sad and very dispirited by how good in relative terms it was in Bulunkutu and by what they are experiencing now. So there's another issue of if the camps are too great, integration into much harsher life becomes a real problem. And sorry, what was the other question that I was?
That's engaging the community members where the pregnant guys are going to be.
I think Musa's raised that issue. No, absolutely. I think that's really fundamental, very important, and where I would say Nigeria, as a result of great civil society work, is really ahead of other countries, including Colombia, where there often was really minimal effort to engage local communities about how they want to receive the FARC defectors or the paramilitary defectors, where it was much more top government driven. So hearing the community perspectives, integrating them, working through with them is very important. That doesn't always mean that one should accept the community view as such. You know, the title of my report from 2018 was "We don't want them back." And the community is saying we don't want them. Well, that might not be what you want to settle with, but rather you want to engage. What is it exactly that you are afraid? How can that be mitigated? How can that be addressed? How can you receive the benefits that you need from those programs? And I think we have 5 minutes. You mentioned some questions that I just could not catch.
Well, I think you've treated basically everything that has been asked. So I think we'll just try to round off now. But I just want to touch on one of the final points that you made in terms of better lives within these camps or within the spaces of rehabilitation than what they have outside. And I could also recollect that talking to some of the women who are associated with the Boko Haram, a lot of them claim that they live lives better in Sambisa Forest. So they live at Queens, they are very well treated. And so they can't spend more than a week or two within these normal communities. They go back to the Sambisa Forest simply because it's difficult for them to adapt. And these are some of the complexities to say that you return back to your first state instead of the kind of life of luxury that you have been living with some of these militants in the Sambisa Forest.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Philip. The experience is varied for some women and men, for the matter, and children. It might be outright slavery and abuse, but for others, at least the assurance of basic food was at various times rather good, and they might not have that once they are brought out. The other big issue is of sexual violence, where many of the women were raped as part of the forcible marriage, but afterwards they were insulated from rape by other men. But that's often not their experience, even in IDP camps. And again, this is not unique to Nigeria, very prevalent in Somalia, other settings, where often in the IDP camps, women who were ex-Shabab, who lived under ex-Shabab rules, or who even didn't, but are displaced, have to prostitute themselves to access food, where the militias that guard the IDP camps often demand sex as a way to accessing food and medication. Yeah. And again, the comparison, as terrible as it might have been under Shabab or Boko Haram, might still be better than, from their perspective, than what they are experiencing in the capriciousness, unpredictability, and sexual violence once they are out.
Wow. So I think this has really been a very engaging experience. We just have like 3 minutes to go. So if you permit me, I would like to use these 3 minutes to thank everybody that joined in the conversation. Some peeped in and left. We're really grateful for your time, and we are trying to make this something that is constant in terms of trying to dissipate knowledge from most of our experts who have been on the field. And how can we transmit this knowledge from the paperwork to people who are actually working on the field? Finally, I would like to thank Dr. Feba Brown. It's always very interesting listening to you, educating us from your wealth of experience in some of these spaces. We know that this time did not do justice to, the time didn't allow you to do justice to some of the things you may have wanted to say, but we've benefited a lot from this lecture. We're grateful to you on behalf of the West African Transitional Justice Center. We hope that this will form the beginning of subsequent partnerships with our center. And we thank you very much for accepting to make this presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Philip, for organizing our conversation, for inviting me to address your center, and to everyone for very thoughtful comments and questions. I look forward to staying in touch and continuing the conversation and learning from you all.
All right, thank you very much. So thank you, everyone, and we're grateful to have you. All right, so bye-bye, everyone.